I'm Robert George. I have the honor to be the director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions here at Princeton. It's my honor to welcome you here today and to also acknowledge with gratitude Murray Bissett, the academic director of our co-sponsor for today's events, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Working together with the foundation, we've put together a program entitled Consequences of an Idea, Assessing 100 Years of Communism. The 100 years figure, actually 101 years, takes us back, of course, to the Bolshevik Revolution. Marx was writing many decades before that, obviously, but the revolution represents the beginning of communism as a dominant ideology in control of the apparatus of states. We have a very distinguished panel. They will be introduced in a moment, but to introduce the panel and moderate, it's my privilege to welcome my friend and colleague, Marzenna James, who is a lecturer in the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs here at Princeton. Her research is on economic power, international political economy. Currently, she's working on a book on the political uses of foreign economic relations in Soviet satellite relations and in today's conflict in the Ukraine. I'm proud to say she earned her degree from the Department of Politics here at Princeton University. She grew up in Poland. Marzenna, thank you, and over to you.
I am truly delighted and greatly honored to moderate our panel this afternoon. Since I came to the United States from then communist Poland to pursue study of international relations, I would like to reflect for a moment on the invaluable perspective offered by our panelists. They have themselves lived the political dynamics of communism, either directly or to their families, friends, colleagues, or have studied the lives and the writings of dissidents in communist regimes. Their experiences and their knowledge, deployed here this afternoon calmly and dispassionately, are our best, perhaps only hope to understand the communist political system. Without the efforts of scholars, of these scholars in particular, and the scholars who research and reflect and write based on the understanding of the really need to pierce through difficulty of finding reliable data, the workings of communism might prove utterly opaque. In communist regimes, governments purposefully concealed information. Transparency was not a desideratum, to say the least. And the ways of hiding the true processes and mechanisms of the political system were so complex and impenetrable, especially for the people from the West, with their very different political and historical experience. Instead of reliable data, the communist political machinery produced an abundance of fake news and fake interpretations, with the goal of capturing, maintaining, and increasing political control over citizens. The citizens were forced to learn the art of saying only positive things about the regime and acting as if they supported it. They often acted not only as if they accepted their communist rulers, but if they were thrilled, they were positively happy to obey what was expected. Only a perceptive analysis of everything, from the practical difficulties, political and economic, to the towering intellectual and moral dilemmas, can pierce through the performance of political compliance. Such analysis made possible the collapse of communism and dismantling of the Berlin Wall in 1989, with the subsequent potential to expand the zone of freedom, prosperity, and peace. To give 3 examples from Poland, I might mention John Paul II, Leszek Kołakowski, and Czesław Miłosz. John Paul II, at the helm of the Catholic Church in Rome from 1978 to 2005, did not explicitly deconstruct the communist political system, but his knowledge of its dynamics, acquired as the priest, Karol Wojtyła, and thus the target of repression, enabled Pope John Paul II to speak to people under communist rule in a way that moved millions to push for democracy. Leszek Kołakowski emigrated to England, were nourished by the intellectual resources of Cambridge and Oxford, produced one of the best critiques of Marxism. Czesław Miłosz emigrated to the United States in 1951. And he laid bare the workings of the communist propaganda machine. Of course, I'm talking about his book, The Captive Mind, never out of print. It exemplifies the enduring value of the rational analysis and systematic consideration of communism. As one publisher of a recent edition put it, written in the early 1950s, when many Western intellectuals placed their hopes in the new order in the East, this classic work reveals in fascinating detail the often beguiling allure of totalitarian rule and its frightening effects on the minds, as timely today as it was first written. John Paul II died in 2005. Leszek Kołakowski in 2009. Czesław Miłosz in 2004. While the need for reliable information and first-hand insight, for rational assessment and lively debate about the workings of the communist political systems continues. In the just published this year, The Road to Unfreedom, Timothy Snyder argues that the communist political system has influenced not only the post-communist governments, or the government of China, or post-communist, for instance, of Vladimir Putin or Viktor Orban, but also the populist, nationalist movements as well. It is in this context of the enduring value of the study of communism that I want to thank the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and the Madison Program for bringing to Princeton University our distinguished panelists. To my left, Carlos Eire, who emigrated from Cuba. Born in Havana in 1950, he fled to the United States without his parents at the age of 11. After living in a series of foster homes for 3 years, he reunited with his mother, but his father was never allowed to leave Cuba. He is now the T.L. Riggs Professor of History and Religious Studies at Yale University, where he has served as the chair of the Department of Religious Studies and the Renaissance Studies program. He has taught at St. John's University in Minnesota and the University of Virginia. He has been a Fulbright Scholar in Spain, a Fellow of our Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, member of the Lilly Foundation Seminar in Lit Theology. He is the author of many scholarly books, including War Against the Idols, From Madrid to Purgatory, A Very Brief History of Eternity, and his magnum opus, Reformations, the Early Modern World. He expanded his audience enormously in 2003 with publishing a deeply moving memoir, Waiting for Snow in Havana, which won the Nonfiction National Book Award. His second memoir, then written by popular demand, Learning to Die in Miami, was published in 2010. All of his books are banned in Cuba, where he has been proclaimed an enemy of the Cuban state. In the center, Sergiu Klainerman, Eugene Higgins Professor of Mathematics at Princeton University, immigrated to the United States from Romania. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, member of the United States National Academy of Sciences, and a foreign member of the French Academy of Sciences. Professor Klainerman is a recipient of numerous prizes for his work in nonlinear hyperbolic equations, including the MacArthur Fellowship. He has served as an editor of many journals, currently Annals of Mathematics, held visiting positions in Berlin University, Hebrew University, Stanford, Scuola Normale Pisa, University of Rome, University of Bologna, of Florence, of Trieste, ETH in Zurich, Newton Institute at Cambridge University, University of Bonn, Heidelberg University, Kyoto, University of Canberra, and on my last count, at least 8 universities in France. A truly international scholar, by his contributions to international scholarship and by international recognition. We are very grateful to you that you came here this afternoon to shine light on the workings of communist systems based on your first-hand experience in communist Romania. And at the far end of the table from me, Flagg Taylor, our James Madison Program visiting fellow this year, an associate professor of political science and director of honors forum at Skidmore College. His teaching includes courses on the history of political philosophy, totalitarianism and dissent, and executive power and constitutional law. Professor Taylor is co-author of the prize-winning The Contested Removal Power, 1789-2010. It shows outstanding academic book. And editor of many books, including The Long Night of the Watchman, Essays of Václav Benda, 1977-1989. Totalitarianism on Screen, The Art and Politics of the Lives of Others, with Carl Eric Scott. And The Great Lie, classic and recent appraisals of ideology and totalitarianism. He is currently writing a book on the theory and practice of Czechoslovak dissidents in the 1970s and the 1980s. He's a member of the Academic Council of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and lectures often on totalitarianism and dissent. He's a frequent guest on the American Cinema Foundation movie conference. To conclude this introduction, let me quote from Ambassador Martin Palusz, a long-time diplomat of Václav Havel, now professor of international relations in Florida University. He commented on the publication of Professor Taylor's recent book, saying, such people like Václav Benda manage to lead and inspire others by their personal example. Their lives and writings prove that there is the free spirit that sets human history in motion again in her dead ends. That is the creative, uncaptive mind that enables humans to find a way from their captivity. It makes me very happy to think that our analysis and discussion this afternoon by the panelists and all the many members of the audience who made the time for it and came in vain is a clear evidence of the creative, uncaptive mind alive and at work. So may I now invite our panelists to take turns, after which I will open the floor to the questions from the audience.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for being here in the rain. I'm going to give an analysis and deconstruction of communism that you might find a bit unusual. As you heard, my books, none of them are really about communism. Not even my memoirs are about communism, even though it's part of the story. I'm a historian of late medieval and early modern Europe, and more specifically of late medieval and early modern religion, Christian religion in Europe. So I'm going to provide you with a historical, phenomenological, and even theological analysis and deconstruction of communism as a religion, because I am convinced, after numerous attempts to change people's minds on what communism really is, and failing, that political belief and religious belief are on the same spectrum and are often one and the very same thing. Let me start with an anecdote, actually two anecdotes that link together, I think, very nicely with my analysis and deconstruction. First time I ever heard the word communism was sometime in the mid-1950s. Backseat of our car, a 1952 Plymouth, driving through Havana, driving past what would become later the Plaza of the Revolution. My parents in the front seat were talking about communism, and I made some stupid comment from the back seat saying, communism, oh, these must be good people, right? Because they help people communicate. And my parents laughed so loudly, they shamed me into silence. They didn't dare, they didn't even try to explain it. Many, many years later, in 2009, I find myself in Prague with the Yale alumni tour. And I am just flattered by the beauty of the city. And remember hearing my parents say, you know, we need to send you out of Cuba. We need to send you to the United States because we don't want you to end up in Prague. Or Moscow, or East Berlin, because Cuban children were being sent. They were being taken away from their parents and being sent to the Eastern Bloc countries and to the Soviet Union. So my parents shaped my mind that way as a child. But in Prague, I find myself constantly running into posters for the Museum of Communism. And not too far from Franz Kafka's house, a thought enters my mind. If I go to the Museum of Communism, will I be a visitor or an exhibit? Both, of course. I experienced communism as a child and tried to forget about it as a scholar, but I kept running into it time and time again. Here's my analysis in a nutshell. Communism is an ideology, which is a set of beliefs, which makes it damn close, if not exactly the same, as a religion, in which you have orthodoxy and heresy. I've encountered communism many, many times in history through my other work. Communism is an ideology, or from now on I will say a religion, that is impervious to empirical evidence, scientific evidence, sociological evidence, and is also an extremely sloppy theology that doesn't base its observations on human behavior. What do I mean by this? What I mean is this. What I mean is that human beings are incapable of pure altruism and of sharing goods equally. It is impossible. In Christian theology, this is since the first century, been proposed, later gets the name original sin. We are flawed. We are flawed, we are selfish. All of us, each human being, each and every human being has self-interest as his or her main focus. And there's never any true sharing. It's impossible. In the history that I study, and one of the branches of religious history that I study is the history of monasticism. Communism has been tried, and in a few cases, it has been moderately successful. Monks, and it doesn't matter what religion monks are, most monks throughout the world, whether you're talking about Asian or Western religions, practice some form of sharing, communism, and rejection of private property. However, if you study the history of monasticism for just 1 month, I would even dare to say for 1 week, you immediately realize that the history of monasticism is mostly a history of failures, of corruption and reform, and a pattern of corruption and reform and corruption and reform, because this whole sharing thing, it just doesn't work. However, it does work sometimes. The Carthusian monks claim they've never had to be reformed because they've never been corrupted. And most historians put a small question mark over this. And it is true, the Carthusians do manage to share without too much fighting. However, in Christian monasticism, which is what I know better than Buddhist monasticism, the sharing is voluntary. It requires an act of the will. As a matter of fact, it requires a surrendering of the will to a small oligarchy within the community, to the abbot, the prior, maybe there are 2 or 3 or 4 more figures at the top. But in the rule of St. Benedict from the 6th century, the very beginning says it very, very, very clearly. The monastery is a place where you can win salvation by employing the bright, strong weapons of obedience. It's all about obedience, but it's voluntary obedience. So, you might ask, where am I going with this? Where I'm going with this is to the proposing that historically it's been proven that communism can work sometimes, to some extent, always with some reform. But it always requires an oligarchy of some sort. And it only tends to work at all, even poorly, when it's voluntary. There have been instances throughout Western history where some monks, or some religious figures have tried to bring out this Christian communism to a larger number of people. We read in the Acts of the Apostles, the 1st century, the very, very early Christian church, the members of the Jerusalem church shared all goods. And that's been tried a few times. The radical Franciscans in the 13th and 14th century actually believed that there was going to be, some of them, spiritual Franciscans, became apocalyptic and thought a new 3rd age of history was about to begin. And that might already give you a kind of faint echo of later communism. third age. First age being the age of the Father is very Trinitarian. First age of the Father is reflected in the Hebrew Scriptures in the Old Testament. The God who revealed himself to the Jewish people. The second age, historical age, was the age of the Son, the incarnation of God in Jesus Christ, establishment of the church. The third age to come was going to be the age of the Spirit, when human nature would be transformed, and everyone would be guided by the Holy Spirit and share all goods. But it would require the end of human history and a changing of human nature. In 1534 to 1536, a group of Anabaptists in the city of Münster in Germany decided to recreate the first century church, very different from the spiritual Franciscans. They took over the city of Münster, abolished private property, and the oligarchy that developed, the leaders of this oligarchy not only lived in the best homes, but married any woman they wanted to. And any woman who turned down their proposal of marriage would be executed. One Catholic bishop observed, "I suppose this is what they mean by Christian sharing." Part of my analysis and deconstruction of communism then is historical, but theological also, and it's very bad theology. And I believe it is possible to speak of communist systems as being governed by bad theology, and of communism as a religion. What's the difference between ideology and religious belief? I've struggled with this question in some of my own work. In the early 1980s, a professor at Rutgers nearby, Donald Kelly, published a book entitled The Beginning of Ideology, in which he argued that the Protestant Reformation is where you can date the beginning of ideology, kind of religion in which there can be no dialogue with the other, in which there's an orthodoxy in which there can be no dialogue. And he put almost the entire blame on Calvinism, which I don't think is correct. But I think his analysis of religious belief as an ideology that influences political behavior and political realities is very sound. And I think it can be applied to 20th century and 21st century communism. In Cuba, right now, they are pretending to rewrite their constitution. And the word communism has been replaced by the word socialism in its new constitution. However, in Cuba, there's still all sorts of laws that reflect the saying of Fidel Castro from early on, from 1959 or 60, can't remember the exact year, when he said, within the revolution, everything. Outside the revolution, nothing. It's an unforgiving ideology which becomes a religion. And the oligarchy becomes a priesthood. And the government, in essence, becomes a theocracy. With an inquisition, a very active inquisition, with heretics who have to be expunged in one way or another, and with a guarding of the tongue on the part of everyone. You cannot guard, cannot peer into people's minds and thoughts, but you can certainly peer into everything they say and listen to everything they say, as was the case with the Spanish Inquisition, a subject in which I happen to have some expertise. The Inquisition had officials who were not members of the court, known as familiars. Familiars were listeners who would listen to their neighbors and report on what they said and report on how they behaved. And the familiars got special perks from the Inquisition. Most communist systems require an inquisition of one sort or another. The one I was familiar with, and again, it's anecdotal, right? My next door neighbors became the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution. They were the familiars. In Cuba, in every block, every town and city, I don't know what it's like in rural Cuba, but in cities and towns, every block has a Committee for the Defense of the Revolution. They're the ones who act like the familiars, report on you. They're the ones who handle your ration card, or ration booklet. They're the ones who handle how your children progress or don't progress in school, according to what they do. Every time we spoke at home before I left, we had to close our shutters, lest we say something that the familiars next door would hear and report. This is still in place. This is still very much in place in Cuba. There are also laws in Cuba, now about to be enshrined again in the new Constitution, with laws such as the ones that allow familiars to report on their neighbors. And their neighbors end up being charged with, and I'm not kidding, potential dangerousness. And their neighbors end up being arrested for potential dangerousness. There are also laws against self-enrichment. It is illegal in Cuba to have more property or more money than one's neighbors. The so-called self-employed Cubans you might have been reading about, there's a cap. There's a cap. And the cap is a tax. Same tax that's applied to the workers at the tourist hotels, where apartheid is a rule. God forbid. No, there is no God, all but God. Castro dynasty forbid that any Cubans stay at these apartheid resorts. A new law was passed. This is going to be enshrined in the Constitution. The law was passed in 2014 when President Obama, or was it 15 or 16, now see, I forget, when the relations were restored between Cuba and the United States. A law was immediately passed that if American businesses were to set up shop in Cuba, Cuban employees would have to be paid. It's the familiars. Oh, you know, my phone is buzzing. I have it turned off.
Flash flood warning. Flash flood warning.
Oh, okay.
It's a dangerous thought warning.
Anyway, employees working for American firms in Cuba, for instance. This reminds me of Münster in 1534-36. Same thing that happens to the employees for European hotel chains. They have to be paid American wages, but they are to be taxed at a rate of 92%. Because it's also a law that no one in Cuba can earn more than $30 a month. Of course, everybody knows this creates a lot of cheating and a lot of handling of an under-the-table economy. But that's the reality there. Based on an ideology that there can be no inequality, and equality has to be enforced. But that in essence, everyone has to be equally poor. The system generates a dysfunctional economy. So you have two evils. The one is theological or ideological, this mistaken notion that somehow you're going to get people to share and to be economically equal. And the other is economic, which is that it makes this theology, this ideology makes everyone equally poor and creates all sorts of cheating. As related to me by my uncle who stayed in Cuba and came to visit once, who was in charge of setting up art galleries for Cuban artists to sell their art to tourists. When he had to set up a new gallery, he would get, for instance, 10 gallons of paint to make the space ready for the artists. He told me. By the end of the day, I was down to 3 gallons because 7 people had walked in and asked, "Where is my gallon?" So the sharing bit is a bit of a farce. And then at the end of the day, as he was about to go home, he would take his gallon of paint, and the gallery would have to be very sloppily painted with 2 gallons of paint. All this because there's a belief that you cannot challenge, an orthodoxy you cannot challenge, that somehow equality of this sort has to be enforced, and people have to be forced to share. Bottom line is, in order to do this, in order to have everyone share, in order not to have private property, one has to employ violence of some sort and nullify individual free will and individual freedom. For children, this means constant indoctrination, and this is about where I'm going to end with my analysis and deconstruction of communism. Constant indoctrination from a very early age. Indoctrination that involves the familiars. The children in school are constantly asked to report what their parents say or don't say. I didn't go to communist school because I got out just in time. I actually didn't go to school for a whole year because my parents refused to send me. And things were so chaotic in 1961, they got away with it. But I got to see the math textbook from my friend Miguel Salas Figueroa, who later in life would end up spending 8 years in prison for saying the wrong thing. His math textbook had the following problem, and this is 5th grade math. Before our glorious revolution, Jose Sanchez used to pay 25 pesos to his scumbag landlord. After the urban reform of our glorious revolution, Jose Sanchez now only pays 5 pesos to the urban reform. What percentage decrease did Jose Sanchez have? So even the math problems were politicized, and that's what I escaped. This indoctrination is thorough, consistent, and constant. And I'll end with this, another anecdote. And of course, all of my experiences of communism are anecdotal, and I would say thank God for that. When Pope John Paul II visited Cuba for the first time, which coincided with the Monica Lewinsky scandal, there was not much attention paid to his visit in the United States. Suddenly, my aunt, who never left Cuba, but taught religious instruction in her house, suddenly faced something unprecedented. She only had about 2 or 3 children that she taught, because she had to turn over the names of every child that she taught religion to, in her case, Catholicism. She had to turn it over to the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution. And any child whose name was on such a list, their so-called free education would end at age 16. But suddenly, after John Paul arrived, she had 30 or 40 children. That lasted about 2 weeks. The third week, she was back down to 3 children because parents were informed by the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution that if they sent their children to my aunt's house, their education would end at age 16. Enforced orthodoxy. Enforced orthodoxy and an enforced system of sharing that never works and never will work. And here I'll end, I'll get theological on you. But I think it's also empirical. I think many, many psychologists would say the same thing and would agree with St. Augustine in saying that human beings need to provide for their own interests. We're built this way. St. Augustine thought it was a flaw in human nature. So let's take out the theology about the flaw. I think it is undeniable that perfect sharing of the sort required by the religion of communism is absolutely impossible and can only be enforced through violence. And I'll end with that.
Yeah, well, so first of all, I should also thank the victims of Communism Memorial Foundation for this wonderful meeting that we have here, and also everybody I'm glad that I'm coming after Professor Eire, because I think he pointed out a lot of things that I also wanted to say, but maybe I'll do it slightly in a slightly different fashion. I did actually spend a lot of time in Romania until the age of 25, to my misfortune, but also to my fortune, because I think I've learned a lot in the process. So first of all, let me start with some background that maybe people don't know. Romania joined Nazi Germany against the Soviet Union in 1941. But not before it was itself a victim of the Ribbentrop-Stalin Pact on aggression, which was made in 1940, which gave Transylvania, so part of Romania, to Hungary, and another part, the eastern part of Moldova, called Bessarabia, to the Soviet Union. At the end of the war, towards the end of the war, when the Soviet armies crossed Romanian's eastern border in August 1944, Romanian changed course by a palace coup engineered by the king, and not by a popular insurrection led by the communists, as it was later described. In fact, the total number of communists did not exceed about 1,500 people, and most of their leaders were in prison at the time when the Russians came, at the time of this coup. And later on, Soviet Union imposed through fake elections a brutal communist regime in Romania. And by the year 1948, in fact, the years starting from 1948 until the death of Stalin in 1953 were the most brutal years, where forced collectivization and brutal elimination of all forms of civil society took place. I was 6 at the time of the historic speech made by Nikita Khrushchev at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in February 1956, which detailed for hours in front of a stunned audience. And this stunned audience consisted of members of the Central Committee. Actually, it was selected. It was secret, so a lot of foreign members, for example, were not allowed to participate, to be in the audience. Some of the awful abuses of the Stalinist regime. That speech, as we know today, shook the entire communist world to its core and prefaced its ultimate demise. The same year saw a popular rebellion in Hungary, bloodily defeated by Soviet tanks. I should also say that in this general background that I'm giving, I should say that Ceausescu became leader of Romania in 1963, so everybody knows about Ceausescu, of course. He became leader in 1963 And the first 7 years saw some liberalization, but it soon became, starting with 1971, it soon became the most repressive regime in Eastern Europe. In fact, it all came after he visited China and was very impressed by the Cultural Revolution, which essentially was at its end, 1971, close to the end of the Cultural Revolution. But nevertheless, was very impressed and wanted to do something similar in Romania. And I mean, I can go on and on and on with what he wanted to do, but let me start giving some personal background. So I'm personally a victim of communism only insofar as everybody living in communist Romania was a victim of the system. In fact, by any reasonable measure, we are part of the elite. My father was drawn to socialist Zionism and later communism as a young Jewish man in the late 1930s, at a time when anti-Semitism in Romania was not only rampant, as it has been for centuries before, but it became vicious and murderous. He was caught by the Romanian border police crossing the new frontier formed in the wake of the Stalin-Ribbentrop Pact when Marzenna became part of the Soviet Union, and spent the remaining war years in prison as a communist. Fact which, ironically, it may have saved his life, since the fascist regime at the time in Romania was treating political prisoners better than Jews. At the time, he was finishing his studies in medicine and thus became known among the prisoners, among the political inmates, as a Jewish doctor, and some of these political inmates became later on, after the Soviet occupation, of course, became leaders of the new communist regime. So he was actually quite well connected. My mother, though not political herself, also had excellent communist pedigree, that she was born in a very poor family, and more important, one of her brothers was more important from the point of view of communist pedigree, what it meant at the time. One of her brothers was executed at age 17 for distributing manifestos against Romania's regime at the time, Antonescu regime, alliance with Hitler in the Second World War. A second brother was arrested, beaten badly, and kept in prison for the rest of the war. The circumstances of being born in a family for which communism presented itself, at least at the beginning, as a salvation, rather than the catastrophe it was for most of the population, placed me in a unique position from which to observe and reflect on the system. To start with, I was intoxicated from a very early age with heroic myths about how selfless communists were building the best possible society while crushing the futile resistance of recalcitrant reactionaries. I was brainwashed to think that the Soviet Union was a paragon of all virtues, to the point that I was absolutely shocked the first time at the age of 8 or 9 when I heard an older kid on the street saying some bad things, criticizing the Soviet Union in ways which I thought was just inconceivable. I consider that incident to be the first moment of a slow awakening. My next shocks came in form of family discussions where my brother was older than me, was bombarding my parents with uncomfortable questions, pointing out stupidities in the party propaganda he was fed at school. My father, who himself must have started to have serious doubts about the system from the time he spent in Moscow. So he spent in Moscow the last few years of Stalin's era while pursuing an advanced medical degree. And in these discussions, he would be very defensive, even angry, trying to defend the system. He was also probably worried that our conversations could be monitored by the Securitate, the Romanian analog of the KGB. His standard reply, elaborated in more vivid terms by my mother, was that we kids had no understanding about what's going on. We had no understanding of how much worse the previous regime was. This, of course, did not help my growing doubts about the system. And then the next big shocks came in the form of books that I was able to read, such as Zero and Infinity by Arthur Koestler. This was really the first big book of the type that I read. And Animal Farms in 1984 by George Orwell, which was circulating clandestinely in French or English. because such books were, of course, strictly prohibited and never translated in Romanian. Later on, I was also able to read in French most of Solzhenitsyn's books and other books, and it's hard to describe their enormous impact on me. What were before growing doubts became now direct challenges to the core of the communist ideology. Another important element in the mixture that led to my awakening was a direct challenge to the official propaganda given by Radio Free Europe, which it still is actually, the United States government-funded organization that broadcasts news and analysis of events to countries in Eastern Europe. One of my most cherished memories of my youth is listening and commenting together with my father, who had by now completed his own awakening to the daily evening news broadcasted by the station in Romania. The station was for us, like for millions of others, our window to the world. But in the end, nothing was more important to that awakening than the direct experience of life in Ceausescu's Romania. It's hard, of course, to summarize in a few lines the daily grind. The net effect that I still vividly remember is that sense that one was living in a schizophrenic world of two opposite realities. The official one, which were being fed from early morning to night on radio, TV, and newspapers, movies, and books, in classes, at official meetings, at school, etc., was a constant celebration of the great achievement of the party and its leader, and the unanimous recognition and gratitude for this of all population, except a small band of reactionary traitors. The second reality, which was the personal reality that which was a personal experience of lack of everything, interminable lines for food and the most basic supply, the tired and beaten faces of people on the street, the automatic, soulless praises for the parties we were forced to express in our classes, meetings, and demonstrations. The reality also of enforced so-called voluntary work to help harvesting the crop, because the collective farms imposed by the regime were awfully inadequate to the task. And obviously, all this led to lack of basic foods and so on. The reality of widespread hypocrisy, cynicism, corruption, and often despair, but also that of the quiet resistance of the population manifested in jokes and private expressions of disgust among close friends and family. So here are some typical jokes of the time. So a person enters a store and asks for bread in Romania, but it could be in any other Eastern communist country or Soviet Union. The said person replies, "Comrade, you are in the wrong store. The place where they don't have bread is across the street. Here they don't have A person stands in line every morning to buy the official newspaper. He buys it, glances quickly at the front page, and is appointed, throws it into a garbage can. Intrigued, the salesperson asks, "What the hell are you doing?" The buyer replies, "I'm more interested in the obituaries." The salesperson then says, "The obituaries are on the third page." The other replies, "Yeah, but not the one I'm waiting for." A new political prisoner enters a cell full of other prisoners who ask him about his sentence. What did he get? He says he got 10 years. They ask him for what reason? For nothing, he says. "You are a liar," they all shout. "For nothing, you only get 5 years." Soviet Union achieved true communism where money was no longer necessary, as people got all they needed from the state. One day, little Ivan finds a ruble, so this was Soviet money, in the attic and asks his father, "What is it?" "A ruble," says the father. "But Daddy, what is a ruble?" "Well, it's money." "But Daddy, what is money?" "Well," says the father, when I was a little boy, my mother would give me a ruble and say, "Sasha, go to the store and buy a bar of butter." "But Daddy, what is butter?" So Radio Erevan, so these were typical jokes that we all knew. Somehow people will ask questions to Radio Erevan and Radio Erevan will answer. So here's a typical one. Radio Erevan is asked, "What is the shortest joke ever made?" And it replies, "Communism." Radio Erevan is asked whether there is life on Mars. It replies back, there is no life there either. Though communism led to disaster wherever it was tried, there are still many people who think that its failure was one of bad implementation, that its principles are in fact both generous and sound. The implication of the comment is that we should try again, God forbid. The systematic failure of communism or other form of non-democratic socialism, wherever and wherever it was tried, from the Soviet Union to Eastern Europe to China, Vietnam, Cambodia, Myanmar, Cuba, and now Venezuela, is not to faulty implementation, but to a fundamental misreading of human nature and to gross theoretical flaws. Though I'm not a political scientist, it's not hard for me to point some of these flaws. The core ideological foundation of communism is that equality trumps all other considerations, like freedom to hold and sell property, freedom of thought and expression, freedom of association, freedom of making basic life choices, like where to live and how to live, freedom of religion, etc. And here I'm coming back to the distinctions, so the thing that we heard before. And when I say that communism values equality over all else, I'm not talking about equality under the law, which is the basis of all modern democracies. What I mean is a more radical notion of complete equality of outcomes. Marx formulated this principle as from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. Sounds good, right? But it's not hard, alas, to trace the origin of most forms of inequalities of outcomes to private property and family circumstances in which one is born. Some people are much better or simply more interested in accumulating wealth than others, and some are wonderful parents, while others are wretched ones. So to avoid differences to outcome, it's quite logical to ban private property and to diminish, if not eradicate, the role of families. How do you implement that? Well, let's just consider private property. Private property cannot be abolished without the use of force because it's in the human's nature to cling to and defend what we perceive as being ours. Given the enormity of the task, the fact that we need to radically transform society and change human nature in order to achieve complete equality, freedom of expression and association cannot be tolerated. Religion, which attributes authority to a transcendent being, is also a major impediment for change, and therefore it should be eliminated. In fact, any civil organization outside the authority of the state may become a focus of resistance and thus has to be forbidden. All means of disseminating ideas have to be banned or carefully controlled. Typewriters, for example, were registered in Romania, copy machines were non-existent. Due process is a relic of bourgeois hypocrisy. We should dispense of it. To accomplish this monumental task, the state needs a large repressive security force to enforce its will and crush any form of dissent. Also, if the state is responsible for all forms of production and distribution of goods, it will necessarily require a strong and massive bureaucracy to plan and take care of all the details. Bureaucracies may work well for a while by focusing on specific big tasks, such as electrification and rapid industrialization in the early years of Soviet Union, but are extraordinarily ineffective when it comes to the myriad details of running a complex society. It's unwieldy, slow-moving, and indifferent to individual needs. Also, we know that people work much better and are far more creative when they feel personally invested in their work, when the fruits of their work belong directly to them rather than to an impersonal state that is supposed to take care of their basic needs. In the end, in a communist society, the relationship between workers and state becomes indistinguished from slavery. Since one has no choice but work for the state, and in the absence of any form of freedom of expression or association, or an independent judiciary, there is no redress to perceived injustices. Slaves of an impersonal state feel understandably justified to cheat the state whenever possible, leading to hypocrisy, cynicism, and corruption. The typical saying in Romania, and I'm sure it was the same in the Soviet Union, is that they pretend to pay, we pretend to work. So this is a quiet response of the population. This in turn leads to the state to rely on even more repressive measures, army of informants, and a huge propaganda machinery. Millions are thrown in jail or in enforced labor camps, which creates a new type of slaves. right? Because, I mean, at least the vast majority of slaves have something. These people have absolutely nothing. Finally, to make such a system work, you need a highly hierarchical elite, a group to plan, make decisions, and maintain order. Since all the power of the states come from the state, since all the power comes from the state, it is natural that the competition for this power will be fierce, and unfortunately, the most successful people are often the most ruthless and the ones who's least scrupulous. As happened so many times in history, unfortunately. But it's particularly bad when the power is centralized and there is only one source of power, which is the one of the state. This in turn leads a state so as I say, since all the power belongs to the state, the competition for power leads to the worst, very often to the worst people of society to get power. And once in power, these people manage to cling to it and also extend it to relative and close friends. Thus, a new stratification of society takes place based not so much on personal property, but on privilege and influence. And this is something that, to me, being there, is really obvious. I mean, you don't sense, indeed, you don't sense that there are differences of people in terms of salaries, but all the salaries are miserable. But the people who are, the people in the elite have all sorts of privileges. And the way they exercise their privileges, or the way they do favors to other people, is completely invisible. I mean, money at least is visible. You know exactly what it takes, right? Everybody can see if somebody is rich or not rich, or if you are not yet rich, then you have a chance by doing certain things that other rich people do, because you see what it takes. In that circumstance, you have no idea what it takes. How do you exercise influence? And the result of that is the creation of essentially an aristocracy, and an aristocracy which is very hard to change, very hard to move, the state power, and so on. Anyway, this leads full circle to the ultimate irony of communism, so wonderfully evoked in Animal Farm, that in enforcing full equality for everyone while banning freedom, one ends up with neither freedom nor equality, and for good measure, a misery of outcomes for everybody. Stop here.
So thanks to both the Madison program and to the VOC, the Victims of Communism Foundation, for putting on this event and having me participate. This is not the first time that I found myself on a panel with people who have actually experienced communism or who've been dissidents, and it's always very humbling for me to share the stage with them. So it's an honor for me to be included on the panel. I've divided my remarks today into three parts. The first part, I think you'll see very much connects to what Professor Eire was talking about. First part is devoted to this, answering this question, what is an idiocracy? I'm going to use this weird term, idiocracy, to describe the communist regime. The second part, I think this will connect to Professor Klainerman's remarks. We'll talk about the experience of living in an idiocracy, what it felt like, what that experience really felt like for people who had to endure communism. And then I'll try to be a little bit provocative in the last part of my talk and suggest some kind of current trends in political and social life today that kind of echo, unfortunately, communist times. So, what is an idiocracy? I mean, the term that you most hear with communism, and I hope you've heard before, is totalitarianism. And a political order that's described as totalitarian is one that aspires to total control of its population and to bring about a really radical transformation in the social and political life of its people. And so there have been many political scientists who found the term useful and who have usually included ideology as one of the features that a totalitarian regime needs to have in order to deserve that designation. But I want to suggest that there are other authors who, while sympathetic to the idea of totalitarianism, think that ideology is not just one of 4 or 5 important features, but it's the most distinguishing feature of a communist regime. And interestingly, I think the people who take this line of thinking are the people who experienced it, figures like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, person who Marzenna mentioned, Czesław Miłosz, and then Václav Havel and Václav Benda, 2 Czech dissidents, whom I'll talk about in a little while. And so in this account, a totalitarian regime becomes totalitarian precisely because it's ideological, precisely because it's ideological. And so I'm going to quote a French historian and philosopher named Alain Besançon. He suggests, quote, ideology is not a means of totalitarianism. On the contrary, totalitarianism is the political consequence, the incarnation in social life of the ideology. Ideology is chronologically and logically first. And so this is why some thinkers like Solzhenitsyn have used the term idiocracy rather than totalitarianism. So how do we explain? I think idiocracy, just to connect this to Professor Eire's talk, other thinkers have used terms like secular religion to give you the same flavor. So it's a slightly different line of thinking, but I think very much similar to the kind of thing that Professor Eire was describing. And so let's begin with the notion that's, again, common in the writings of the dissidents of ideology as organized and systematic lying. The communist parties who rule in the name of the proletariat, this universal class, gain their legitimacy by their claim to have understood and operate according to the scientific laws of history. Such regimes claim to be unerring actors, right, in the fulfilling of these historical laws. And so ironically, these regimes claim to be more lawful, right, and more rightly ordered than any regimes in human history. And so once in power, these communist parties that rule in the name of the proletariat, they have to demonstrate that their rule is justified. They have to display for their citizens that socialism, the socialism that was promised, right, is currently being realized. And so because reality proves recalcitrant, you have a vast and complex system that emerges, and it engages everyone in the display of socialism's presence and power. And so more than a few people have talked about this as a sort of vast, immense stage production, right, that everyone participates in. Now, it's important to point out that this sort of lying is different from an ordinary falsehood, an ordinary fib. Again, I'm going to have recourse to this French thinker, Besançon. He argues that the teller of the ordinary lie, the ordinary fib, stays in touch with the truth, and knowingly distorts the truth. The ideological lie, by contrast, seeks something much deeper. It seeks to impose a pseudo-reality upon reality. It does not depart from reality so much as completely ignores reality. And then here's the most important part. It seeks to disrupt our normal access to reality. So as Besançon writes, in ideology you have a different process. You no longer entertain truth against untruth, but you witness a curious splitting or decomposition of reality itself. You are dealing with 2 divergent realities, a reality and a pseudo-reality. A reality that you can see and hear and touch, and another that exists purely in your articulations in language and propaganda. And I would add that the reality that you can see and hear and touch is what you are constantly taught to ignore. It's what you are constantly taught to distrust. You're taught to distrust your practical reason. So the schizophrenia that Professor Klainerman talked about is very much in keeping with this argument. So living within the lie, this experience, what is it like to live within the lie? Again, it's only the pseudo-reality that has allowed public recognition, and so all public interactions are infused by the dictates of ideology. This means that people who live in communist systems are both victims of the system, but they're also pillars of the system, because everyone has to, again, participate in this stage production. They have to constantly conform their speech and their actions to fit the demands of the party. This can mean publicly affirming the guilt of someone who you know didn't really commit a crime. So an example, let's say Lee. Lee's a nice guy, he's my friend. I discover that Lee has been arrested for reading the works of J.R. Tolkien. He's a horrible, Western author who you could be caught in Czechoslovakia for having. Well, if I went to my union meeting following Lee's arrest, it's likely that I would have had to raise my hand and affirm the guilt of Lee and the legitimacy of his punishment, right? Everyone in my workplace would have been asked to do the same thing, right? So that's one example. Other examples, in Czechoslovakia, you would have had to put out the Soviet flag on national holidays, which, as you can imagine, would have rubbed you the wrong way, probably. You would have had to attend a May Day parade. You would have been required to vote in elections that you knew would have been meaningless. Or in Václav Havel's paradigmatic example from one of his essays, which I'll talk about in a minute, if you were a shopkeeper, you would have had to put up a sign in your window that read, "Workers of the world unite," every day. And so, again, you have to participate in the construction of this elaborate network of appearances, rituals, and patterns of speech, all of which were dedicated to putting forth this fiction of a flourishing, just socialist regime. Now, you might expect that the consistency and the pervasiveness of all of this lying would have been appalling, all this mendacity would have been appalling, but that would have been true only if your faculties don't become numbed, right? And you're able to see those fictions for what they are. But in Havel's words, the pseudo-reality, quote, acquires a very peculiar but real strength. It becomes reality itself, albeit a reality altogether self-contained, one that on certain levels may have greater weight than reality as such. The significance of phenomena no longer derives from the phenomena themselves, but from their locus as concepts in the ideological context. And here's the really crucial part. Havel writes, reality does not shape theory, but rather the reverse. It then appears that theory itself, ritual itself, ideology itself, makes the decisions that affect people and not the other way around. And so in this precise sense, totalitarian regimes, ideocracies are inhuman. Power becomes increasingly anonymous. Real people with names and faces and personalities seem to disappear. To use Havel's terms, people feel the system's automatism or social autototality. Everything seems like it's on autopilot and there's no way for anyone to penetrate the system through ordinary human agency. And yet in Havel's telling, this inhumanity only develops because there is something in modern man that lends itself to the creation and perpetuation of such regimes. People prove themselves in some cases, in many cases, to be quite willing to play the various roles that are ascribed to them by the party and the state, to allow themselves to become tools in the maintenance of the pseudo-reality around them. And so there's a kind of slow, ongoing self-annihilation. Havel calls such people demoralized persons. They become incapable of thinking of anything higher than their own material interests and survival. And this is why the atmosphere in the communist world, especially in the late 1970s and 1980s, was saturated by a kind of emptiness, a kind of apathy, kind of rampant hedonism and nihilism that's really difficult for Westerners to appreciate. Two anecdotes to try to illustrate this emptiness, and another example by way of contrast. So first, 1977 was the formation of Charter 77, which was this human rights organization in Czechoslovakia dedicated to calling out the crimes of communism and making sure that people knew when someone was unjustly accused by a crime. And Václav Benda became one of the spokespersons fairly early on in its history. and he was interrogated and then arrested, which we'll talk about in a minute. But during his interrogations, his STB officers, the people who interrogated him, were just flummoxed. They were puzzled why he would involve himself in this organization. Benda was not, a little more historical background here, after the Soviets invaded in '68, the party was purged. And so your party card could be, you could be expelled from the party, which was sort of the lowest circle of hell. Your party card could be canceled, which is slightly better. And then ironically, in the late 70s, you were actually better off if you had never been a communist. And so Benda, by comparison to the people who joined the charter who had been communists, these guys had already lost everything. They had nothing to lose by joining the charter. And so the interrogator knew that Benda had never been a party member. He had a decent job. His wife had a job. They had a decent flat on Charles Square in Prague. And he could not believe, he could not comprehend that someone like Václav Benda wouldn't be satisfied with his, however meager but decent material life, right? And I think that's the kind of demoralization that Pavel was talking about. He just assumed that Benda must be just insane, right, for wanting more, or for thinking that he could have more. Second example, so the counter examples to this demoralized example. So Václav Benda goes to prison in 1979 for 4 years for being a spokesperson for the charter. In 1983, he is released, and a party is thrown at the Benda flat in his honor, welcoming him back into quasi-freedom. And immediately upon his entry into the flat, a petition is thrust into his hand. It says, you have to sign this, you have to protest the unjust imprisonment of some poor guy. And then his wife, Camilla, walks up to him. And remember, Camilla was a woman who had her own job. She had 5 children at that point. The Benda flat was a haven for people who were persecuted by the regime. She's constantly having charter meetings, circulating petitions. So she's a busy, busy person. And one of the first things she says to him is that he should immediately resume his role as spokesman for the charter. Because if he did that, then the regime would know that his imprisonment had no effect on him. Imagine that, right? That's the first thing that she says to him. You're like, hey, welcome, honey. Why don't you calm down for a while and help me with the kids, right? It's the opposite. It's just sort of stunning, right? So just some people were immune from this demoralization. And then Miloš provides another perspective on this phenomenon in the captive mind. He suggests that people try to solve this problem by becoming actors. That they send out a public self that navigates the world of appearances. They would utter correct phrases, behave in the prescribed manner, while trying to preserve space internally, right? That they keep separate from this ugly, farcical world. But this act of self-preservation, according to Miloš, seems over time to damage the very self it seeks to preserve. While inhabiting the role is quite self-conscious, remember, this stage, so to speak, everywhere. And so surely the wise course is to err on the side of continuous, conscious acting. And of course, remember that there are examples, and I've seen this in the files, the secret police files, in my trips to Czechoslovakia, there are examples of spouses ratting out spouses, priests ratting out parishioners and fellow priests, right? So you really couldn't know who you could trust. Miloš says, conscious acting, if one practices it long enough, develops those traits which one uses most in one's role. Just as a man who became a runner because he had good legs develops his legs even more in training. After long acquaintance with his role, a man grows into it so closely that he can no longer differentiate his true self from the self he simulates. So even the most intimate of individuals speak in party slogans. So last part, are there any currents that we should worry about today in contemporary life? Well, remember that according to these dissident thinkers like Solzhenitsyn and Havel and Benda, communism in the East was a manifestation of a broader crisis of Western civilization. So they did not expect that the collapse of the communism in the East, right, to necessarily solve all of these broader problems of modern civilization. Havel called communism an extreme version of the global automatism of technological civilization. So, these currents today. One, I suggest, is in the hyper bureaucratization of life. And I think this is a pretty widespread phenomenon that you're probably all familiar with if you work in the corporate world, in education, in medicine. Havel writes beautifully about the experiences of bureaucratic anonymity and futility in his plays. I would recommend one in particular called The Memorandum. The philosopher Robert Solokowski sums up why bureaucracy can be an attack on your very personhood. He says this: "It is demoralizing to be shut off from one's prudence and to have to follow routines that lead nowhere. One has to live in a kind of personal falsity, doing things but knowing that they are not what they are supposed to be. One is trapped by regulations, forms, meetings that inhibit what they are supposed to facilitate. People caught in such false copies of prudence have to renounce their prudence and hence discredit themselves." So second current that I think is interesting, I'm going to call this, I see this in our political life today, I'm going to call it the performative lie. And this is a kind of middle ground between what I described as a kind of ordinary falsehood and then the comprehensive, full-fledged ideological lie of communism. Remember, an ordinary falsehood stays in touch with the truth. It's kind of a knowing departure. And the teller of this ordinary falsehood wants to convince you of something. At some level, it's rational, right? It's discursive. The performative lie, I suggest, doesn't seek to convince in the ordinary sense of that term, but it's not really a comprehensive assault on reality either. It's meant to convey something which is supposed to awaken or reinforce certitude and militancy. The performative liar seeks to create a closed conceptual whole for his followers and partisans, and perhaps cultivate a certain kind of disposition towards enemy institutions and people. And this sort of lie cannot allow for discursive questioning and challenge from outside of its circle of partisans, right? And I see this on both the left and the right. Lawrence O'Donnell and Sean Hannity, right, might be example. Third place, I see a kind of contemporary example. This is the persistence of a kind of perfectionism, which was very much a feature of the ideological politics of the 20th century. This shows itself increasingly, I think, on university campuses in the form of the now, maybe dominant is too strong a word, maybe prevalent culture of activism. Passion and engagement are the watchwords here. The activist shows himself or herself as a kind of fanatic, always certain that the enacting of a certain program will bring an end to societal dysfunction and injustice. But this fanaticism isn't driven primarily by unbridled passion. Rather, it's the result of an intellectual error, which should recall ideologies like revolutionary socialism. Here's a quotation from a Hungarian philosopher named Eire Kolmai. He says, quote, "Perfectionism does not mean loving or desiring the good or some value too fervently, too wildly or impatiently. It means loving the good arbitrarily under its possible perfectionist aspect, as if it must represent an all-good world, a togetherness and finished harmony of good things, and an all-around union of advantages." So in this telling, the program of a perfectionist does violence to the reality that actually exists, right? It seems to oppose this comprehensive system. And so I suggest that the praise of activism and passion and engagement, the cultivation of this activist mindset is deadly to the university's mission. Loud, confident, strident voices are applauded, while quiet students are presumed not to be engaged. At best, they're called apathetic. At worst, they are, quote, part of the problem. Thus, what institutions of higher learning have done with this fetishization of passion and activism is to destroy the space for intellectual modesty. Without this space, institutions of higher learning are dominated by impassioned fanatics, knowing cynics, and careerists willing to say whatever provides the path of least resistance. And that is a scene, I think, that would be quite familiar to dissidents like Solzhenitsyn, Havel, and Benda. Thank you very much.
So we have one tradition in Princeton, I think it's a great tradition, that the first question is asked by students. So is there any question from a student we can take first? Very good. Since we have time only till 6:15, while the students are collecting their thoughts, we will open to everybody else. Please. John, yes, we have a student. Yes, very good.
Great. All right. So thank you very much for your talks. I appreciated all of them. They were fascinating. So thank you for being here. My question has to do with sort of our collective memory and recollection of communism. I think, as you noted, it's as every year we're moving historically further away from the sort of reality of communism. My own grandparents, who are now quite old, escaped from communist Czechoslovakia in 1966. But as we go on in history, the number of survivors will inevitably dwindle. And so how do we ensure that sort of these visceral memories of communism, and that's really sort of the most powerful warnings against it, how do we make sure those aren't lost to time in the coming years?
One solution is to give money to the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. That's not even a joke. They do these wonderful witness videos that are very well produced and usually 7 or 8 minutes long, and allow victims of communism to speak for themselves and tell stories like the ones you've heard from Professor Klainerman and Eire. And so that's one solution. And I'm working as hard as I can to get the dissident writings out, so interviewing people before I can't anymore. But yeah, I just think we need to tell the stories of the dissidents and get them to talk about their experiences.
But maybe more importantly would be to really understand.
I turned it off.
Oops, sorry. Yeah. More importantly would be to really understand what are the reasons why communists failed so badly, and have a way to educate students about it, right? So I don't know how this could be done, but I imagine this is something that it's independent of the memories of the survivors of the system.
And unfortunately, there are still places where people are living under it and experiencing it nowadays. So even though other generations in other countries might fade away, there are still people who won't fade away for another 60 to 70 years or so, or longer, perhaps.
Yeah, I'm wondering, this is a very, very strongly anti-communist panel, but I think it's fair to say that, I would say that the response of Western intellectuals to communism was underwhelming, to say the least, if you look at how bad it was and how clearly bad it was after, quite soon. And it's as a university professor, I think quite a bit about this. How badly, it's not everybody certainly, but so many Western intellectuals who were actively supported communists, and all these were quite enthusiastic, first about Soviet Union, and when all these communist regimes cheered, and then were quite aggressive at attacking people who were pointing out, in many cases, the evil of communism. I wonder if you had thoughts either on why this was, or what lessons we can take away from that, if you agree with my characterization.
Yeah, I certainly agree, and I certainly remember when I left Romania, I came to France and the States, and I was shocked to have discussions with colleagues, intellectuals, so to speak, professors. I don't know. But in my case, most of them were mathematicians. And so this was, what, it was 1976, 7, 8, 1980. And they looked at me with suspicion that, if I left, there's something wrong about that. If I left, it means that I'm, by definition, somebody who should not be trusted because, well, what did I do? So, it is one of the things that really bothered me for a long time, still bothers me, that it's a system that was created by intellectuals, starting with Marx, Engels, and Lenin, and Trotsky, and so on and so forth. Romania, the same thing. I mean, the vast majority, even though the system was supposed to be for workers, right? The whole point was that the workers were supposed to run the system. But there were very few workers. In Romania, there were very few. I mean, one of the reasons Ceausescu actually became party, the chairman of the party, was because he was one of the few who was not educated. So actually, my father tells me that he knew him in prison. He was a totally uneducated guy, very smart and very ruthless. But totally uneducated, and somehow at the time when he was supposed to be chosen, at the time when the previous leader, Gheorghe Udej, died, they had to make a choice for a new one. There were lots of other people who were all much better educated intellectuals, and there were maybe two who were working class people, but somehow the system was supposed to put working class people in front. Therefore, they chose Ceausescu. So this was how he was elected. Anyway, so the intellectuals are responsible for what happened, and I think until today, I don't think there has been a serious evaluation of why did that happen, and what are the reasons why, as you say, so many intellectuals participated in it. There's been no serious self-criticism, I don't know, understanding of why were they wrong, and so on and so forth. So, for example, everybody accepts that there's some, Nazism was something terribly wrong, but people, when they talk about communism, it's better. So, for example, any kind of fascist regime, Nazist regime, is of course completely banned by anybody, right? They, with the exception of a few crazies, the vast majority of the population, all the parties in any country that we are talking about, will stay away from those parties. But communist parties are acceptable all the time, right? Until today, it's perfectly okay to have a communist party join some kind of political alliance. And so on and so forth.
And if I may add an example, it's okay to market hammer and sickle vodka, but good luck to you if you market swastika vodka. There is actually a product, hammer and sickle vodka. I don't know if you've seen it. It's very beautiful vodka.
True.
Yeah.
I would love to continue, but unfortunately we have run out of time. To our panelists, I think everybody will leave with the feeling we owe inestimable gratitude for your acute understanding of this paradoxically immensely repressive but very murky, impenetrable political system. Thank you.